Hey guys, it's Shaylin and I'm here today with another writing video. So today I'm kicking off a bit of a mini series on revision. This series has been such a long time coming. For years, a video on how to revise a book or my revision process has been requested very heavily for years, and I've always wanted to wait until I felt confident in my own revision process in order to make this video. The area that I think I have improved the most in the past couple years is with revision. It used to be something I felt very intimidated by, and even though I had written a bunch of books as a teenager, I'd never really done much revision on them. Some of them I had done some revision, but I'd never really fully revised a book to a point of being done or almost done. I mean, when is a book done, to be honest? But I do think that I've gathered a lot of experience with revision. In the past couple years, I've edited one novel basically to a point of as done as I can get it, 8 drafts. Finished editing a short story collection, and I'm currently revising another book. So I feel very confident in my revision process, and I have learned so much about revision throughout this. I think revision has been the thing that I've actually been working on the most, more than drafting, in the past couple years. So this is the start of a series of 2 videos on revision. Today I'm just going to be talking about some revision tips. Tips for tackling the revision process, because I know it's overwhelming. I know it's scary. I was overwhelmed, and I still am overwhelmed when I jump into revising a book. For me, at least, it is the most overwhelming part. So I just wanted to share a bunch of tips and things that I have learned through doing so much revision over the past couple years. The follow-up to this video, which will be next week or within the next couple weeks, I'm not sure exactly, is going to be a draft breakdown of my own revision process for one particular book and how I revised that book and what every draft looked like, the changes that every draft needed, and the tools that I made in order to help my revision process. So the first thing I wanted to talk about was draw a bit of a distinction. I think that there are kind of 2 general types of writers, and of course you could be a blend of both or switch depending on the project. But I think that there are drafting-focused writers and revision-focused writers. A drafting-focused writer likes to do the bulk of the work in the drafting stage. So they might draft very slowly, draft very carefully, revise as they draft, and emerge from the first draft with a pretty clean draft and one that is generally what they want. A revision-focused writer likes to do the bulk of the work in revision. So they're more comfortable refining their vision through editing rather than drafting. So they might draft very fast, 0 draft, do a bunch of rewrites, emerge from a first draft maybe very quickly but with a very messy draft that is kind of just an outline or just a sketch, and then do a bunch of rewrites and do a bunch of revision. So I think those people are a lot more comfortable with revision, and that's why they like to focus the majority of their book's development in the revision stage. Whereas a drafting-focused writer is more comfortable with drafting and so likes to focus the bulk of the work in their book's development in the drafting stage. I am definitely a drafting-focused writer. I am much more comfortable drafting, and so that's why my drafts are slow. I edit them as I'm drafting, and I like to make them as clean as possible. I still do need to revise my manuscript, and I still needed a lot of revision on my manuscript, but I'm more comfortable with drafting and I like to put the focus there. Someone who is a revision-focused writer is probably not going to relate to these tips that well. First of all, you probably don't need them because you probably are much more comfortable with revision and it's a natural thing for you. You probably do way more rounds of revision and approach revision very differently because you're spending very little time on the draft and then doing all the refining in editing, whereas someone like me is taking a long time on the first draft to refine it as much as possible by the time I get to the end of that first draft. There's nothing wrong with either method. If you're a more drafting focused writer, you might resonate a lot more with these tips because you have a more similar process to me. The first thing I just want to say, don't be scared. It is overwhelming, especially if you're like me. This can be a really overwhelming part of the process. I think you kind of just have to dive in. I find that starting to revise is the hardest part because it's overwhelming. You start to psych yourself out, you get scared. You have to just dive in and go for it, you know? You don't know how to fix everything. You don't need to know how every piece will fit into place. You kind of just have to get started, and once you get started, it'll be more manageable than when you're looking at the book as a whole, like, oh god, how do I fix this? So keep that in mind going into this video. It's normal to be overwhelmed, especially if you've never revised a book before or you're just not as comfortable with revision. But I think it's one of those things you have to just go for it and start, or else you'll procrastinate so much that you'll never do it, and you'll build the task up to be more overwhelming than it necessarily has to be. So let's get into some tips. Number one, this is less a tip and more a mantra, but I wanted to reiterate it. Revision is not a punishment for bad writing. And this is one reason why I think I used to struggle with revision, is because every time I had to address a problem in my work, I felt like it was punishment for being a bad writer. You know, if I had to fix the structure, it's like, okay, well, this is why are you bad at structure? Like, why couldn't you do it perfectly the first time? I always felt like if I were just a better writer, the draft would be better and I wouldn't have to do this revision. The amount of revision that a project needs is not equivalent to your skill, and it's not equivalent to how good your book is or your book's potential. Different books, regardless of the skill of the author, are just going to need more or less or different types of revision. That's okay. Having to fix things does not mean that you are a bad writer at all. See every problem as an opportunity to make the book better, to enrich the story in new ways. I've learned to be actually a bit thankful for the mistakes I made in the first draft. I think about how if I'd written an airtight first draft, which is impossible for a novel at least. Novels are massive. They're huge. You're not going to write an airtight first draft of a novel. But hypothetically, had I done that, there would have been no way to pierce into the revision. The story would have actually lacked a lot of depth. It would have lacked humanity. It would have lacked organicness, because that came from revision. And it was actually the problems and the mistakes I'd made that paved the way for new layers of depth to be added to the story. So see revision as an opportunity, but it is not a punishment for being a bad writer. And if you see it that way, revision will be painful because you're going to spend the whole time feeling like you're only doing this because you were a bad writer and a better writer wouldn't be here, and that is not the case at all. The next thing to remember, again, more a mantra than a tip, it will get worse before it gets better. The initial stages of editing can be messy, but you kind of just have to accept and embrace that. See it like renovating a house. You have to fix the foundations, the plumbing, the wiring, before you can start decorating. You know, it can be easy to see revision as decorating, which is more like the line editing, you know? Painting the walls a nice color, putting up some art, you know, that's nice, but that's cosmetic. And if the pipes aren't connected, it's not going to be a livable house, even if it looks beautiful on first glance. So sometimes revision is going to mean tearing down a wall so you can get at the wiring, fix the floor plan before you can start decorating. And that can be painful, because sometimes, even if you have a full house that you've built, even if it's imperfect, at least it looks like a house, you know? Having to tear down parts of it can honestly make you feel like you're making it worse. Maybe for the time being you are making it worse, right? If you cut giant sections of stuff, the book is no longer a cohesive whole, but you need to do that in order to implement your revisions. Sometimes revision can make it look like a total mess, but you have to just embrace that and know that this is temporary. And when you do patch it all up together in the end, it's going to be even better than it was before. Tip number 3, get organized. So I've talked extensively about how I consider myself a discovery writer, so someone who does not do a lot of outlining beforehand. I think when it comes to revision, I think that getting organized is imperative, at least for me. It can be very overwhelming if you don't have a clear game plan. You know, I think this is where I have to get out of my very type B inclination to just go with the flow, which works great for me in drafting. The only way that I find it's manageable to approach revising a book is to break it into very small, very well-organized pieces and tasks. If you can make clear outlines and lists of what you need to do, you know, having an outline with all of your edits where you can see the book as a whole and you can rearrange the pieces without having to be in the actual draft, where you can maybe list all the changes you need to make to any given chapter or scene, so then you can just focus scene by scene, chapter by chapter. That will really help make the process feel less overwhelming. So get organized. I know for me, usually one of the first things I have to do when I start revising a book is go through the notes app on my phone and organize all the stuff that I've taken random notes on for the past few months while I've been thinking about the book, and actually organize it. So organize all the material in whatever way makes most sense for you. It'll just really make the revision process more manageable and less overwhelming. Tip number 4, make the tools that your book needs. It's very difficult to, for me, have a consistent revision process. Yes, I do have methods that I go to time and time again, but the thing is, every book has different problems that need fixing, right? In one book, you might have issues with pacing. In another book, you might have issues with causality. In another book, you might have issues with character. In some book, you might have a mixture of all three. As a result, it's always going to look different because you have different things you need to tackle, right? So I would recommend making the tools that you need at this point. And that's always going to be different. So I'll talk about this in my draft breakdown from my revisions. One of the main issues that I had to address in my book was causality. So making sure I had a clear causal chain that connected every single scene. There were a lot of points in the book where that causal chain was not clear or was not there. There were missing links. So I made what I called a causality list. It was literally a list of every scene in the book where I literally wrote out what the causal connection was between every single scene. I use that to revise my book's causality. And so whatever you find the problems are in your book, create tools to help you. If you're not really sure what tools would help you, feel free to drop a comment below, and I or anyone else who's maybe had that issue can try and suggest something. When I think about a tool for revision, a lot of the time it's just writing out what you need to fix in the clearest way possible, right? So I was having issues with causality, so what I had to do was write out the causality. If you're having issues with character arc, what you probably need to do is write out the character arc. Finding a way to organize and write out whatever it is you're struggling with so you have a template for that thing that you can reference will be very, very beneficial. Tip number 5, try writing a pitch or a synopsis. I find that this is a very helpful tool, I think, for anyone at this stage. Revision is a really important and good time to identify central themes, ideas, character arcs, and plot arcs, and do that in a legible way. Obviously, you may have had ideas for a lot of these things before you started writing the book. They may have changed or something may have clicked while you were writing. So I think that one of the best ways to identify these things is to write out a pitch. Imagine you were pitching your book to an agent or to a publisher. Write a snappy pitch like you would find on the back of any given book you pick up. A good description on a book kind of highlights all those things. And so I have found that writing out pitches and synopses has been the most helpful thing for me to solidify themes and character arcs and really get at and write down so that I really know what I'm saying, right? Sometimes you know in your brain, but until you can say it and you can write it out, it's hard to work with. So just writing down exactly what you're going for with character arc, theme, etc., can be really helpful to give you that direction so that you can hone the themes and arcs of your book. Tip number 6, build the process around what your book needs. This is very related to what I said about tools. Create the tools your book needs. Build the process around what your book needs. If you are trying to restructure your book, that's going to be a very different editing process than if you're focusing on, say, developing characters. If you need to further develop characters, then probably what you need to do is go to individual scenes and flesh out their voice, add relevant details, maybe add relevant flashback or information, make sure that characters are acting in character in every scene. That's probably going to be more a matter of working through the book in maybe a linear way and analyzing every scene to get as much out of your characters as possible. But if you're restructuring the book, then you probably need a completely different process. Maybe you need to get some cue cards down, rearrange it on the floor, and it's going to look very, very different. So I think that the best way to approach revision is to identify what your book needs and build the process around what your book needs, rather than trying to have a process for revision and make that process fix what your book requires, right? Like, start from the problems and then build the process, rather than using the process to identify the problems. You might find, as you revise multiple books, certain strategies for revision that really work for you. For example, working linearly helps for me for the earlier drafts, or I get overwhelmed. I know that about myself. At the same time, I think rather than nailing down a specific process, so for this draft I do this, then this draft I do this, then this draft I do this, etc., it's better to go, okay, these are the problems I need to fix in revising this book. What process is going to help me fix those problems. It's a bit different from drafting. You know, obviously with drafting, you might adapt the drafting process to fit your project, but I think with drafting, it's more about understanding your process and what yields you the best results. Whereas I think with editing, it helps more to have a more problem-focused approach where you're adapting your process or even building your process based on the specific issues you're trying to address. Tip 7, order tasks in a way that is manageable for you. Different people will have different ways of ordering tasks in a way that feels most approachable for them. I find it really helps if, let's say I have a list of 20 edits I need to make, and I do this more for the later drafts because for earlier drafts I do like to work linearly, but for later drafts, let's say I have like a list of just 20 lingering things I need to do. I find it helps for me to just knock off the little ones. So it's like, okay, I need to add that sentence, I need to adjust that one detail, and just knock them off until now I'm left with just 4 edits, but those are the big ones and it's easier to focus on them. Personally, that helps me. It helps me go into those big tasks with a clear mind. And this is how I find I work in general, right? Like you can take from other aspects of your life and learn about that to apply to your writing. I'm the same in a work day. I like to just get the little tasks done, reply to those emails, whatever, and then I can just deeply focus on the big tasks for the day. That's how I like to work. Someone else might be the opposite. They might like to start when they have the most energy at the beginning, tackle the biggest issue, and then doing the remaining things is just super easy for them. Number 8, I would recommend trying this process if you're overwhelmed. Cut, order, add, adjust. I find that this is a really natural way of ordering my revisions. Let's say I'm looking at a chapter. So the first thing I might do is cut everything that can be cut. Because if it can be cut and it's just there, it's going to be muddling things and it will be easier to focus if that's just gone. So cut things that can be cut. Then order, so rearrange scenes, content, so now everything's in the right order and you have the right structure. Step 3, add all the new stuff you need to add. And then step 4, adjust everything so it all makes sense and it's all cohesive. Tip number 9, if you have 2 different problems, sometimes the way to fix them is with one solution. If there's a problem you're really struggling to fix in your book, the way to fix it might actually be to tie it to another problem. So I had a really great example of this in my novel. My book is in 2 parts. In part 1, I had a character who was being forced to act out of character in a lot of scenes and was kind of being used in plot devicey of a way. So he was being forced to do things that didn't really fit his relationship to the main character. In part 2, I had a character that wasn't being utilized as much as I would have liked in the book. And so what I did was I bridged those things. That character that was in part 2, I wrote that character into part 1. Those actions would have actually been realistic for this other character to take when they were kind of forced and devicey for the original character making those choices. So those were 2 separate problems that I had that were fixed by bringing them together. And a lot of the time, asking yourself how you can fix 2 things with one solution, how you can bring them together, first of all, creates more cohesive plot because you're tying various things together, but also that can click the solution for you. So next time you're struggling, like there's a problem but you don't know how to fix it, see if the way to fix it is by intersecting it with another problem and finding a common solution. Tip number 10, don't worry about fixing everything in one draft. Editing takes layers. It's like painting a wall. It looks better with every subsequent layer. Just do what you can right now. You may not know how to fix everything or even know what every problem in your book is, but instead of waiting and holding yourself back until you can do a single perfect draft, just fix what you can fix now. The more that you fix, the more the rest falls into place, you know? Every bit of progress you make through revision will make more stuff fall into place. Don't worry about it being perfect. Just do what you can, and the more you do, the more revelations you will likely have about those things you're struggling to figure out. Tip number 11, slow down. Editing is the time to take a deep breath, slow down. What you eventually want is for it to be as strong as it can be, so slow it down. Editing, especially on the line level, too fast, can actually cause you to start glazing over the book and potentially even edit out your style. And I'm speaking from personal experience because I did this. I got to a point in the book, I'd been editing it for a while, I was starting to get a little tired, so I started kind of just reading it too quickly, not attentively enough, and I started making edits that were actually editing out the style and editing out the sentence rhythms, and it made the prose feel monotone and dull, and then I had to go back and fix it, which is a huge pain, right? If you feel yourself trying to glaze past chapters too quickly, it might be time for a break. Pause, rest, take a few days off, and come back when you have a clear mind. Editing inattentively can cause new problems, so you want to edit very attentively with a keen eye for detail, especially if you're working on the line level. Tip number 12, if you encounter something you don't like, get rid of it or make it better. If something bothers you, it's not going to stop bothering you, right? If there's a scene that you just don't like, either find a way to make it better or get rid of it. I have this policy for lines. If I encounter a line I don't like, sometimes it can be easy to just be like, I'll come back to it later. No, if you don't like it, fix it or cut it. It's not gonna stop bothering you. I can tell you that. So just fix it now, especially if it's a small thing. And finally, tip number 13, don't add filler. While you're writing a first draft, there's certainly a time and place to just write filler because you're trying to get through the draft. That happens. Sometimes you write a scene that is a placeholder that is not very good, and you just have to because you're keeping up momentum and you know you're gonna come back to it. Now is no longer the time to do that. You no longer want to waste time writing content that you know you're just going to cut later. Obviously, you still later on might need to cut things you add in revision, but don't do it on purpose. I encountered this with a book that I was just editing. I was getting quite burned out near the end of the draft, really tired and struggling to write new content. And so I kind of realized, okay, I don't have the energy to write new stuff. I can't think of new stuff. So instead of writing stuff that's going to be bad and I'm just going to have to cut later, I'm just going to focus on doing cuts. And I'm just going to cut the stuff that I can cut, come back and add it later. You want to avoid adding things that will just, again, need to be revised later. Let's say you get to a point where you know you need a new scene, but you're not really sure what it needs to be, so you kind of just write something random. You're like, I'll write something better later. All you've done is create another editing task for yourself, which is to come back and write a new scene later. It would be better to just know something needs to go here until you can figure it out, rather than writing something bad, because that's going to be a distraction, right? It's going to be harder to edit a book if there's extraneous content that's not doing what it's supposed to do or is just clogging up the book. So if you don't know what to do, just focus on cuts, but don't add filler. So that is all for this video. Those are my revision tips. I would love to hear your best and favorite revision tips in the comments. I think we can all use them. We can all use as much help as we can get. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you in another video.